When a Conservative conference discusses the economics of national belonging, it invariably leads to a debate around whether the government should pursue a protectionist and redistributive economic model or a free market and free trading one. Since we left the EU, this has become one of the primary questions on the British right, and it has yet to find an answer, as this conference shows. To an extent, we should not expect an answer to be found. The British Conservative movement is a wide collection of anti-socialist voices, but recent economic stagnation has intensified this discussion, with the laissez-faire and the dirigiste both blaming each other equally. I have to say, I'm one of the free marketeers, or perhaps what Tyler Cowen might describe as state capacity libertarian. I think an open and deregulated economy is not just the best way of delivering national prosperity and national belonging, but it goes with the grain of British instincts and British history. I would like, from some of my experiences in government working in Whitehall, to cast a little bit of scepticism about the actual ability of the British state as it currently stands to solve our problems. The Victorian philosopher Henry Sidgwick came up with an elegant description of nationhood in 1891. He wrote that it is essential that the persons composing a nation should have a consciousness of belonging to one another, of being members of one body, over and above what they derive from being under one government, so that, if their government were destroyed by war or revolution, they would still hold firmly together. This usefully makes a distinction between the nation and its government. National belonging, in my view, is something that comes from us as individuals rather than something provided to us by the state. The government and the state certainly have a role to play, but that should focus on the fundamentals, first principles, and setting overarching terms for our society, whether that is by controlling its borders, maintaining justice and freedom of expression, national defence and setting clear standards and regulations, and importantly taxing lowly and fairly, and allowing the British people to find their national belonging ourselves, whether that's individually, culturally, institutionally, or through family and friends. This sounds very big society, not big government, to use a phrase from another era, but that was grasping at something true, something Burkean about the social contract in Britain between the living, the dead, and the not yet born. The problem with modern interpretations of Burke is that they have been taken to necessarily mean a larger state with heavier regulations, more aggressive redistribution, instead of a focus on prosperity. I don't think this works, and I think Milton Friedman was right to say that a state which prioritises freedom over equality will get a good deal of both, but a state which prioritises equality will get neither. I think this can be applied usefully to national belonging. The National Conservative movement states that it has a qualified support of free enterprise. While offering a welcome rejection of socialism, it also attacks globalised markets and multinational corporations, suggesting that they're parasitical enemies of national sovereignty. This criticism can lead us to solutions which I think are self-defeating for Britain. Its implicit image is of a nation ransacked by asset strippers and for the benefits of overseas shareholders. And I don't think that describes why British economy isn't firing on all cylinders today. I don't think anyone really believes that an excess of economic liberalism or a state which is too weak or too small is behind our troubles. I believe the problem is a dysfunctional state and a government too sclerotic to act in the national interest. We arguably live in a post-liberal economy already, or perhaps a post-liberal economy that has the weaknesses of both post-liberalism and laissez-faire economics at the same time. So while the British state isn't that protectionist as Juliet described, and is unlikely to give subsidies to strategic industries, it is also highly regulated, highly taxed, increasingly uncompetitive, and hostile to free markets. Ministers genuflect at the idea of free enterprise, but don't implement any policies that allow them to flourish. The only area where they seem to embrace supply-side liberalism is immigration. But I admit there are also aspects of our economic model which can seem aggressively laissez-faire and against national interest. Some have said it should embrace the opportunities of supporting businesses through the procurement sector and through greater subsidies or tariffs now we're outside the EU. And others have rightly criticised the foreign ownership of much of our steel and energy infrastructure. But I think these criticisms miss the root cause of our problems. The failures of the British economy stem from our inability to get the basics right, as a consequence of bureaucratic ineptitude and overreach, which distorts markets and rewards incumbents and incompetence, not the forces of global capitalism. This holds us back. If we look at energy policy, Britain has the highest energy costs in the developed world, but it's not a result of free markets. Energy companies supplying our homes have their profits capped by a government regulator. The prices consumers pay are set by the state. The problem lies elsewhere, in the state constraining and regulating energy supply, taxing it, forcing up costs almost by choice. Look at how we're winding down extraction from the North Sea, imposing climate change checkpoints on new drilling licenses, despite North Sea gas being far cleaner than imported gas, imposing windfall taxes which are sending investors fleeing from Britain, refusing to authorise the safe extraction of onshore gas, and then, of course, the decades-long failure to build a new generation of nuclear power plants. That final point is being addressed at long last, but the state is still finding ways to suffocate the process, whether it's the continued vacillation over the authorizations for Sizewell C, or insistence on running yet another review for small modular reactors instead of allowing many of the privately funded companies, planning permission and sites to develop their own plants. And anyway, it still takes a decade to plug new sources of energy generation into the national grid, and the state seems averse to allowing private enterprise to build new good infrastructure to speed this up. So I don't think anyone could really describe this bureaucratic nightmare as free market. It would be hard to say that the national conservative solution to this should be greater state direction. Similarly, the planning system is beset with problems which have been criticized by many people at this conference already. It is unpredictable, arbitrary and expensive, and it works against national prosperity and national belonging. It has radicalized many young people like few other policy areas as well. Our structural inability to build sufficient housing and infrastructure in the areas of highest demand while operating a very, very liberal migration policy is shutting generations of young Britons out of the dream of home ownership, which is by far the best way of binding together an individual with their society and their nation. Do not confuse the large profits of developers or landlords as evidence of a market gone wild. They're a consequence of regulatory policymaking and a system accessible to only the best funded incumbents. The National Conservative principles explicitly attack crony capitalism, saying that the selective promotion of corporate profit-making by organs of state power should be energetically exposed and opposed. This is a good description of our planning system and much of our economy, and I think it's somewhere where National Conservatives and Libertarians can probably agree. This does not sound like the problem is free markets, but a dysfunctional and corrupt and hostile state, opposed to enterprise and competition, in cahoots with incumbents and their lobbyists. There has to be a way of delivering national belonging through free markets and free enterprise in Britain. Britain has neither the landmass, resources or sheer economic weight of the United States to pursue an autarky economy, and there is little point in trying to do so. We need to find something else. A philosophy of British prosperity should embrace free markets and state capacity, because so many of our problems don't just come from our state's size and reach, but its incompetence. As a conservative, I believe in the importance of regulation by principles rather than outcomes. I believe nations are far more likely to find the outcomes they desire by getting basic fundamentals right, rather than taking a dirigiste approach to fitting the economy and human society into a model. People simply don't work like that. By limiting the ability for creative destruction, we will impede our progress and prosperity, even if we try to demand specific outcomes which we all agree might be sound. This is why the government's paralysis on things like retained EU law and Brexit reform is so frustrating. It isn't just about removing specific pieces of EU legislation, it's about reshaping our whole approach to regulation and growth along organically British lines. The tens of thousands of policy officials in Whitehall could be looking at ways to replace the prescriptive, anti-innovation European approach to regulation with a common law approach which encourages good outcomes and high standards and innovation, instead of focusing on regulatory box-ticking, process and compliance. But alas, they are not, and box-ticking still reigns supreme. While ministers pay lip service to creativity and entrepreneurship, their own bureaucracies act as if they are still in the EU, regulating markets before they appear, unable to wait and see and trust our well-developed legal system to manage disputes between businesses or people without a heavy regulatory body. I would far rather fix these problems first before we talk about industrial strategy, subsidising manufacturers of batteries, vaccines or semiconductors. I must disagree with Michael Gove and now Juliet. In today's Whitehall, embracing industrial strategy would amount to another round of picking winners in subsidies beset with absurd blob-influenced conditions, risk assessments, equality impact assessments, just as J.D. Vance describes the Inflation Reduction Act's conditions in America yesterday as well, actually. And none of these would grow a new British Google. Our mission statement instead should be cheap and plentiful energy, abundant housing and easy development rights for industry. These would be far more likely to encourage growth, prosperity and the next generation of tech and business titans in Britain. Failing to do so is a tragedy of modern Britain. The Conservative government is failing on these two driving forces behind Brexit, that is sovereignty and immigration. Sovereignty is being chipped away through the shadow alignment of the Windsor Framework and the corresponding abandonment of regulatory reform to outcompete the EU. It may be eroded further by the government's enthusiasm of harmonising our corporation taxes at the OECD level, which removes another tool for making Britain an attractive place to invest, and Parliament for some reason continues to hand even more powers to unaccountable quangos. And now to immigration. I think we should consider Henry Sidgwick again in his description of nationhood. It is not possible to avoid addressing immigration when discussing the economics of national belonging in this way. And it's hard to know where to begin when it comes to the political betrayal we have seen on immigration from the government. It looms over any discussion about national belonging, growth, productivity, crime, or housing. It makes these problems harder to solve. Indeed, anti-housing sentiment will get greater as new housing isn't seen as a way of helping young Britons onto the housing ladder to have families of their own, but as towers of demographic change that the public voted against repeatedly. Businesses which used to be central local employers are looked on with suspicion for their seeming enthusiasm for employing people cheaply from abroad. And yet while ministers have accused them of being addicted to cheap labour, we haven't seen any progress from the government itself towards policies which will enhance productivity, wean our economy off low-skilled foreign labour and towards greater automation. It is yet more talk. Though this is a decades-long problem, with many fathers to blame, the current government must take the lion's share. Not simply for record numbers, but for the repeated breaking of its own promises to control and reduce immigration. Its decision to respond to Brexit with further increases, suggesting that there are skill shortages not just in nursing, but in Pilates teachers and florists, to name but two inclusions on some recent skill shortage lists. Immigration of such pace, turbocharged by the potential expansion of the franchise to even more non-citizens, which is clearly on Labour's mind now, would make national belonging a distant dream. Instead, we'd have the UK economic zone, a high-tax Dubai with bad weather and higher crime. Yesterday, Jacob Rees-Mogg referred to the nation-state as an organic development out of a people rather than something imposed from above. I largely agree with this. This is as important for national belonging as it is for economics. When people sing the national anthem, put bunting out for a coronation or a jubilee, coach their local cricket team or refurbish their village church or enlist in the armed forces or the police, they aren't doing it because the government has asked them to. Their expressions of national belonging have not come from a list of recommendations written by civil servants. They have come from something else, an ancient national culture which is not directed by economic policy, but of course is nonetheless affected by economics. Instead of creating this vision in Whitehall, our state should set the terms of the British people to deliver it for themselves. We are a great people and a great nation, let down by the state rather than enabled it. It is not the protection of Whitehall that I desire, but the freedoms and justice guaranteed by the Crown and Parliament, which will do far more for prosperity and belonging, I believe, than any tariff or subsidy. Thank you very much.